afternoon. Hello everybody, you're very welcome. This is our second event in the Unboxing Open Scholarship series. My name is Siobhan Dunn, I work in the library, and I'm just going to do a couple of housekeeping while we're waiting for Conor to join us. So as I said, this is the second event, and we had a first event there in February, and it was very interactive and we got loads of discussions going, and one of the big themes that came up was around quality. So we said, why not formulate the next event to speak to that? And that's where the seed for this event grew. And so Conor O'Carroll, Dr Conor O'Carroll is going to talk to us today about taking back control in research. And it's a very timely topic. Conor was here last week actually for the LIRU doctoral group were over visiting Trinity, and the Dean of Graduate Studies organised a panel session for researchers and postdocs, and that was really dynamic event, and Conor covered all things, as did the whole panel, about culture change. So I'm sure he's going to follow that on today in his talk. Just a couple of basic housekeeping things to note. The bathrooms are back down the stairs, underneath the stairs where you came up. In the unlikely event that we have a fire, there's a fire exit just over here, I'm advised. There's a little sign there, and we'll break ththrough into house 6, Shane assures me, so let's see how that goes, but hopefully it won't happen. I just want to say as well, just important to point out that we have a website there, and what we're trying to do is populate that with ideas from you guys around events that you would like to see, conversations you would like us to kickstart around open scholarship. And we also have an email address there as well if you want to contact us. And very much today, any tweeters that are out there, if you could tweet with the hashtag Unboxing Open Scholarship, that would be great. We'll keep the conversation going, and we're keeping an eye on the tweets and the communications as they come in to try and make it as relevant to the community as possible. Let me see. We have a couple of things just to mention as well. I mentioned the events for the year ahead. We're very interested in, having conversation pieces like today, but we're also looking at more practical hands-on how-to workshops. Everything from how to do your data management plans to maximising your research impact. And then we're also thinking about doing, later on in the year, a round table with various stakeholders, for example, PIs, early career researchers, funders, etc. So we have a few ideas percolating around the events, but it's really important that you guys, as part of the community, are feeding into that as well. And we're very much interested in hearing what people think. So there's, as I say, if you could send your ideas or any questions even you have around open scholarship and the task force as well, that would be very useful to hear. So you've seen the layout for today's session. Shortly we're going to be hearing from the Dean of Research, Linda Doyle, but before that we're going to be hearing from my colleague Helen Shenton, the Librarian College Archivist, who's going to set the scene for today. Thank you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and a very warm welcome to everyone. I'm the Librarian and College Archivist, and together with the Dean of Research, we founded and co-chaired this task force on open scholarship. Slightly guerrilla. We're not accountable to anyone at the moment. We're not part of the board and the council. It's just we're very exercise, engaged, interested, but nobody's got the answers about open scholarship. We're working a lot under the LIRU umbrella. The LIRU has brought out a roadmap to what they call open science. We're calling open scholarship. And there's lots of things that need to happen, and then a lot of it is around culture change. So what we have set up is a task force to look at everything around open scholarship. Where should we be? Should we be leaders? Should we be followers? What do we have to do? What's mandated by the funders? What should we do to be good scientific citizens, and so on? And as part of that, we've set up these unboxing scholarship sessions, and they're very much around a conversation. We want to hear, as every single person in this room has got a different take on this, has got a different opinion. There are things that we'll do from a university point of view, or that the rectors, particularly the LIRU rectors, their next meeting is all around open scholarship. So there are things that are in the jargon top-down and mandated, like the funders, but there's also everything that from a personal point of view, whether you're a researcher or a young academic or whatever, how are you going to respond to this and what do you think about it? And the Associate Dean of Research and I went to a brainstorming session in Brussels, and it was very much all about mandating, but equally, and forgive me those of you who were at the previous meeting, previous session, the slide that had the biggest impact on me was a tweet by a researcher, a European researcher, who said, "I've been thinking about this for a year, and I am now committed to open scholarship. So watch out contributors and watch out publishers." So the point is that that was their personal commitment. So there will be things that are institutional, there are things that are Europe-wide and whatever, but there's also, we have to have these conversations, and the best bit to me of our previous session was when a colleague who absolutely had a lot of concerns about open access and whatever, I saw in deep discussion with the Dean of Research, because we need to figure this out conversation by conversation by conversation. We have a task force, we have a website and a lot of information there, our response to Plan S, which I'm sure a lot of you have all been engaged with, and then it's under the auspices of this task force that then we're having this series of events. I think, and on that note, I'll hand over to the Dean of Research. Thank you.
Sense of impending doom, and Lorraine is going to come up and say a few things. Lorraine's going to be juggling until Conor turns up. I'm afraid at this stage, or doing something. We normally, I'd hate anyone to think that we lose our speakers this easily at the beginning of the event. But in any case, for people who don't know me, my name is Linda Doyle. I'm the Dean of Research here, and Lorraine Leeson at the end is one of the Associate Deans of Research, who is very involved in this as well. I think Helen has said pretty much everything that's important. I just want to make a small few other points. So we have a new research strategy that has finally gone through the 10,000 committees that you need to go through, and it will be launched very soon. And lots of people have made lots of input to that. And the last chapter of that strategy is very much about looking forward to all of the things that are changing the research culture and the research landscape, and things like open scholarship therefore form an important part of that. I suppose when I stand back, there are kind of three topics: open scholarship, understanding impact in new ways, and engaged research, which all kind of have echoes of each other and kind of overlap. And it's very important for us as a university to understand, as Helen said, where we want to go on that journey and how far we want to go. From my perspective, I always, of course, have an eye on the fact that funders have put in obligations for us to behave in a particular way, and in some cases we just have to go along with that, and in other cases we also have to question and figure out that that is the right way that the research world is going. And I suppose I would echo that what we're doing with this unboxing practice is we're considering this year a year of learning for us as an institution, so we can kind of get to better grips with all of the terminology, with the different approaches. And I, people are constantly asking me hard questions, like Kingston gave me a whole range of hard questions earlier, that as and I think you said it as well, that we haven't worked out the answers to those yet, but that's kind of the purpose of this. I would say as well, and depending on what discipline you can come from, there can be very fixed ideas about what open access means or what open scholarship means, and in some areas people kind of laud it, in other areas associated with kind of really poor scholarship, and these are the kind of things we need to break down and take apart. So I am glad to see our speakers arrive. Lorraine, you don't have to juggle. Do you want to come up here and introduce Conor so people can see you, because you're very involved in this? Conor, you're very welcome. So you don't. Do you want to just say a few words about Conor?
Sure, no problem.
Yeah.
Hello, everybody. I feel like we should say, this is like the Price is Right. Come on down, Conor. The Price is Right. And when we're talking about the economics of open scholarship, I'm sure that somebody in the house will say, but the price is definitely not right. So it is good to see. I was just about to tap dance. So you saved everybody from that.
Thank you.
So Conor, let me introduce Conor. Conor is the chair of the European Steering Group on Human Resources and Mobility, focusing on research career development as part of the European Research Area. This is a long introduction, so bear with us. He's led the development of the European Framework for Research Careers and the Principles for Innovative Doctoral Training. He's a physicist by training, and he also has a PhD in physics from UCD, but we still let him in. He has very extensive experience of policy formulation, having worked with the European Commission's DG Research and with the Irish Science Policy Advisory Agency Forfos. He has deep experience of the operations of funding agencies through his time with the Marie Curie Programme, Enterprise Ireland and Science Foundation Ireland. And I have to say I personally benefit from his good advice, because he was my advisor when I put together an ITN proposal. We didn't get the money, but we'll try and get it. So what can you do? But the advice was spot on. So, that's all wonderful. And now he is involved in a range of things. He has a great research interest in doctoral training, in researcher career development, the development and impact of national European R&D policy. And his current focus is on research career development and mobility in the context of open scholarship. And it's because of all of this that we thought he would be an absolutely wonderful person to come and talk with us today, to continue the conversation, and of course also to prompt us when he's gone away to talk some more about the things that he says. So Conor, without further ado, the floor is all yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lorraine. And first of all, apologies, I got my timing wrong. I thought it was 12:30 to 1 lunch, right? So at least I got a little bit early on time. Sorry about that. Actually, before I start, a plug. Lorraine was talking about doctoral training. Well, I'm on the steering group for a conference that is taking place the first week of September in the Herrenhausen Castle in Hanover. It's sponsored by the Volkswagen Stiftung or the Volkswagen Foundation, and it's a global conference on the PhD, Forces and Forms in Doctoral Training. And it will be very interesting because it's an unusual combination in that usually we talk to ourselves in Ireland, UK or even Europe, but this stretches beyond. This will include participants from South America, from Africa, from Asia, from Australasia. So it really is global in that sense, and I think that'll be quite interesting. So look it up. And I'll be tweeting it and doing various other things as it gets closer to the time. Anyway, when I spoke to Shane about this talk, I said to him, well, I want this to be a bit provocative. And I said, taking back control. So we all know what that means. And, except in that particular instance, it wasn't going to do with it at all. They always had control, just pretended they didn't. Why researchers should take responsibility for their own research and for dissemination and for ensuring the highest quality? Well, there's a lot of good reasons for this, and I'm going to talk through it today, and a particular focus on a number of aspects, and the role of, those of you may not be aware of Robert Maxwell, famous of the Sun, or not sure it was the Sun or the Mirror, I was never sure, can't never remember which, the famous publicist and self-publicist and millionaire Robert Maxwell played a key role in the whole scientific publication industry. In fact, he was one of the founders and make loads of money out of scientists, libraries, research funders across the world as a consequence. But let's define what we mean by this. And I think one of the first, open science. Remember, the term open science is always used in the European term of science, the broader, all disciplines including humanities. I prefer myself open research. But this is a very clear definition. It's done by the Foster Project. Very good one, in fact. Very good website with lots and lots of detailed information on it. And if you just read through it, it's the practice of science in such a way that others can collaborate, contribute, or research data, lab notes, other research processes are freely available under terms that enable reuse, redistribution, and reproduction of the research and the underlying data and methods. Now, if you stop to think about that for a moment, that is what research should be. It's not a question of doing something new, it's what it should be and how it has been in the past. But what has happened is that the dynamics of, let's say, the convergence of a number of factors, the publishing industry, the drive for greater investment in research by governments, and concomitant with that, the need to measure, and to measure to be conflated to one or two metrics, to numbers, simple numbers which don't actually measure anything in terms of quality of research, has driven research away from this. from what, indeed, it actually should be. This is Foster. This is a schematic, diagrammatic representation of that. Open notebooks, open data, open peer review, open access, open source, scientific social networks, citizen science and open educational resources. And citizen science in that context is not about public outreach, it's about engaging the public in research directly through, for example, it's very much in the case in the area of patients. And interestingly enough, about 2 years ago, the Health Research Board here put out a public call for members of the public who actually wanted to be engaged in defining research questions in the whole health area. They were oversubscribed. They had to shut down the registration within 4 days because they were completely oversubscribed by people who wanted to be engaged. I mean, I know health is a particular area, but it nonetheless showed the interest of the public in research itself. Now, before we go on, I want to go back in time to two people. And some of you may know them, some of you may not. The one on the right you probably know. The one on the left, less so. Tycho Brahe was a Danish nobleman and an astronomer, and a brilliant astronomer in the 16th century. He was the last so-called naked eye astronomer. He didn't use a telescope. He used very refined instruments, but relied on his own eye. And remember, you've got to really reset your clock in terms of how things worked. Nowadays, if you want funding, you go to SFI, the IRC. Then, if you wanted funding, find somebody rich, preferably a king. And in this case, it was the king that looked after Tycho for a greater part of his life. Gave him an island where he could build his own observatory. But what was important about what he did was he actually made very, very accurate measurements of the fixed stars, comets, and the movement of the planets, Mars in particular. Very, very accurate. So accurate, nobody else had it at that time. So he had the data of the 16th century in terms of astronomy. He was also one of the people who looked beyond the so-called Ptolemaic view of the universe, where everything was geocentric, was Earth-centric, the fixed stars were fixed. He was one of the first people, he observed wasn't the first, but he observed a supernova in 1572 and was able to show that it was actually within the field of the fixed stars, showing that things were not immutable, that things were open to change. But despite all of that, he was heliocentric. He believed the Earth, at the same time, despite all of these things, that the sun went around the Earth. And there was perfectly good models to explain this at the time. But he had problems. The king died. The king's son, who was quite young, was looked after by a council. They didn't like him. So he ended up having to leave, plus the fact that the island he ran, the people didn't like him there either, so they rioted on him. And he had to scarper. And he ended up in Prague. With the emperor there, who was quite magnanimous and knew of his worth. Plus, at the time, any good astronomer was also casting horoscopes as an astrologer, which was a very effective way to make a bit of cash and ingratiate yourself with monarchs and that, and tell them how wonderful they were going to be. At the same time, a young Johannes Kepler, who was German in origin and came from a noble family with no money, and had been teaching at Graz in Austria, but had to leave, ended up also in Prague. He had some great ideas about astronomy. He wanted good data. He didn't have it. And he worked with Brahe for a number of years until Brahe suddenly died. Using that data that Brahe had, he was able to develop his 3 laws of motion of the planetary system, which were quite revolutionary, which laid the basis then for Newton's 3 laws. But the point was Kepler moved from the geocentric to the heliocentric. It was the time of the Reformation, so things were changing. There was more open aspects on this. But when you look at the whole dynamics of the process, you were looking at a system whereby people collected data. They published the data in books. By the way, Brahe didn't want his data copied. He wanted his unique book kept. And he didn't want anything done until it was completed. But what people did was then they self-published, by the way. They wrote letters, they self-published, sent it around to other astronomers. Other astronomers would send letters back and they would openly review it, open peer review, because they openly sent letters back with their names on it. These could be quite nasty, by the way. They turned into quite nasty fights in that period. But what you were seeing is a methodology of how science was being developed at that time, in terms of how it worked, how people shared information and shared data and developed new laws from it. I mean, without Brahe's data, Kepler could have never gone ahead with his 3 laws of planetary motion. And they were critical in the next stage of developments of gravitational forces, etc., with Newton. So it was that kind of interaction, it was that kind of open interaction, plus the fact that we're highly mobile. They had both moved to different countries for different reasons, and they had a common language in Latin. So it was a different world, but actually, in some sense, not unlike our own in terms of what has become a common language of English and science. But let's go back to open research. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of it, Plan S, which I actually don't remember the reason the acronym stands for, but it doesn't matter, because what it is, a coalition of funders of research, including the European Commission and our own Science Foundation Ireland, soon to be joined by others, have made a declaration that by 2020 they will not fund research that will be published in closed access journals. Simple as that. There's been talk about opening up access to information for many, many years. In Ireland we have the green open access, so you put your stuff up on the Tara site here in Trinity, gets reloaded up onto the RIAN website and is open. But that's through a special deal with publishers. What's been happening is that everything's been getting more expensive. There has been a drive towards more open access, and the publishers have resisted. So the funders, who are the most powerful in all of this, said, we're not going to tolerate it anymore, we're simply not going to fund this. Now, the reaction has been quite interesting in a way. I think there's a few things there. A League of European Research Universities actually met here last week in Trinity, simply said, this is what you need. If you want a kick system, do it. Eurodoc, a federation of doctoral candidates right across Europe, have said, yeah, that's fine, but we need to modernise how you evaluate research if you do this. Publishers say researchers want the freedom to publish anywhere. As long as they publish with us and pay us, large amounts of money to do so, that's fine. Some people say it won't work without China, the US, but I don't know if you know, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has signed up. The NIH, the National Institutes for Health, are also looking to signing up to Plan S. So it is developing momentum in many different ways. If you look at what's happening in India has the chief scientific advisor in India has said, we're going to join this. University of California's system, UCLA, UCF, San Francisco, etc., have said, no, we're not paying for your journals anymore, Elsevier. They're too expensive. Period. We're gone. We're out of it. And the Germans have done the same. So what you're seeing is a revolt from the system itself against this. Of course, the high-profit subscription journals critique Plan S because it's not in their interest. On the other side, if you look at who's using open access, there was very interesting work just only last week in Nature magazine that the pharma industry is actually using more and more open access publications and data, as are many other companies, for the very simple reason is they can get them. They don't have to pay huge subscription rates to the companies for these. Or, of course, if you're totally stuck, you can go to SciPol and you'll get everything you want for free there. I think there's a 15 million lawsuit against the owner of that by Elsevier, if they can find her. But everybody continues to use it. I've used it myself to access actually a paper I published in the mid-90s in PhysRev, and which I was going to have to pay the princely sum of $40 to get. So I said, well, there are other means. But look at this. I have the reference there. This article is well worth reading in The Guardian if you look at Elsevier made a 36% profit margin in 2010. It remains like that. It's only ever increasing. It's a global value of 19 billion in the scientific publishing industry, right? This is incredible. They're making more money. They're making money at the level of the music and the film industry. They're making more money than Apple, Google, or Amazon posted in that year. This is phenomenal amounts of money. And the thing is that it has developed a momentum that's actually very hard to push back. Because what happened was Robert Maxwell who actually drove this change after the Second World War. He recognized there was a gap here. You had scientists wanted to publish. At the time, the academic journals of that were pretty crap. They weren't very well produced, they weren't very well edited. It could take a long time for your stuff to get through. So he convinced he would bring senior scientists together, take them on boat trips, feed them, good food, lots of wine and that, and tell them, look, you know, you come to us, we'll organise it for you. We'll have quick turnaround times. We'll just do all the management. Don't worry about that. Somebody else is paying you. You don't have to pay for it yourselves. You know, the government will pay. So don't worry about it. And that drove it. And he was smart. He said, you know, if you sell newspapers, you can only sell so many. If you sell bottles, you can only sell so many before you saturate the market. But hey, if it's science, you just create a new journal, and then all the people in that niche area will go towards it. I mean, if you look into the Web of Science, you will find the Ukrainian Journal of Tractor Management. I doubt if it has a very large readership base. Nonetheless, it is a journal. And there are many like that. And that's what has happened, that explosion of journals. Quality, of course, is questionable. And along with that then, which is crucial, is the fact that publishing in some of these journals has become effectively the passport into a job. And the way that your publications are measured through citations, etc., has become a whole market in itself. Interestingly enough, Elsevier, the biggest, when Plan S was announced, very recently they have bought up many of the bibliometric companies. So they bought up Mendeley, for example, which is one very good one, in fact, with very good tools, and probably paid a very nice price to the people who ran it, but it means that they're looking even beyond the open access journals and still looking at the whole bibliometrics area and the measurement. This is a piece of work which I was partially involved in just about 2 years ago, and I was running 2 working groups for the European Commission on open science and open skills and rewards. And one of my colleagues there, Bernard Rentier, who's the former rector of the University of Liège, they had done a piece of work with looking at what you're seeing there is a plot of the number of articles published in Nature between 2012 and 2013, and over a 2-year period, and the number of citations that appeared. Now what you notice in that is that in terms of the diagram itself, the high citations are all peaked in a small number of articles. The point is, even within this, 11% of articles published in Nature in that period got 0 or 1 citation. Now the point is that if you publish in Nature, you get your impact factor of 41. This is fantastic. It means your work is absolutely brilliant, except whatever you've done is not being read. It's not that interesting, it may be a small field, but nonetheless the idea that just because you publish in a particular journal you're going to be great, it simply doesn't hold water. But let's look at what's driving open research, and I think what really needs to change to make things happen. What's actually driving it is Plan S, is saying to people, we're not going to fund it anymore. And also within Horizon Europe, the next big European funding programme, which is also driving this as well. And we know that when there's big funding in Europe, when it's over 80 to 100 billion, people will respond in terms of how they behave. But in my view, that's the wrong way around. What should be driving open access and open research is quality of research itself, research integrity and reproducibility and reliability of research. Because this is something which, when you publish in an open domain, you can have these. You won't have them in a closed domain. And a good example in terms of research integrity is a Dutch psychologist, Dietrich Stapel, who published over a number of years basically false research based on false data. Now the point was always made afterwards that if that data had been in the open domain, if other psychologists would have been able to see it, it would have been clear to them this stuff was made up. Now his motive, and it's an interesting motivator, because Stapel was already famous. He wasn't somebody trying to rise up in the system. He was already established in the system. He had certain hypotheses. Of course, then I think he got deluded in thinking that his data should match his hypotheses rather than the other way around, and he got on a roll and he kept publishing, but it was all wrong. And he was fired. But the point is that if you invert that and you have an open system, you actually work against scientific misconduct, against falsification of data, etc. You also help reproducibility. Big issue. Can you reproduce the experiments? If you have the right data, maybe you can. I'm just going to jump ahead a little bit. But there is a big issue. If suddenly tomorrow we go to open, then what happens to everything? in the sense that, can you do it? Do you have the abilities? Do you have the knowledge, the skills in that to be engaged in open research? And will it translate into your career advancement? Will it translate into grant evaluation procedures? Will it translate into career progression and recruitment by universities? So if you're not publishing in Nature, Cell, Science, or whatever is the hot journal in your field, and you don't have the high impact factors, if that's still the measurement or the metric by which you're assessed in terms of all those things, it's very hard to go into the open science domain. Might well be if you're well established, but for somebody who's up and coming, that is a real challenge. There's a couple of reports on this. There's been a whole group of reports, in fact, in the whole area of open science. And if we look at skills, for example, what are the skills you need? You need skills for open access publishing. You don't need to be an expert, but you need to know a decent amount about it. You certainly need to know to be able to identify the good journals, because there are excellent journals in open access. There's also an awful lot of rubbish, but it's how to distinguish these things. Data is critical. How to prepare your data, how to have metadata, how to have it in a position where it can be stored into an infrastructure, which can be accessed by others. Open science skills around professional research conduct, research integrity. Legal skills to some extent, because if you're going to publish open data, what happens if it's patient data? What happens if it's commercially sensitive? What happens if it's data in social sciences that may relate to surveys of people that might be possible to be identified? So there's issues around those that people, they don't need to be experts, but they need to be aware of all of these things. And finally, from the broader concept of citizen science, skills to know if you want to actually engage citizens in research, how do you go about it? Just as a matter of interest, this was a survey conducted through the European Commission, and about 10,000 respondents across Europe, a big group of them at the PhD level. But what it showed was that during the PhD, despite all the talk you hear about transferable skills, generic skills, disciplinary skills, only about 1/3 across Europe actually received those skills during their PhD. So the impression that this is being mainstreamed across everywhere is simply not true. A second thing we came to was if you want to change how you assess people, how do you do it? How do you change going away from your journal impact factor, your numbers of citations, as a way of actually assessing people in terms of their of career progression, of grant evaluation, or any of these things? And what we came up with was what we call the OSCAM, the Open Science Career Assessment Matrix, which has already been implemented in pilot forms in a number of places. The University of Antwerp, for example, is doing it. The Health Research Board here has partially done this in the way they changed their early investigator award criteria. But what we looked at was, if you want to look at a career assessment matrix, you've got to look at things like the research output, the process, service and leadership, the research impact, teaching and supervision, professional experience. You must broaden the whole base upon which you assess people, rather than narrowing it down to a small number of publications. And depending on what career stage, it has a different, for example, at the level of R1, or let's say the PhD level, teaching and supervision is not going to be a factor in terms of somebody's assessment. It's going to be about the research output process and their research impact. Now, if you look a little bit more detail, there's a lot more detail on these, but it's to change the approach away from simply how many, have you published in Nature, have you published in PhysRev, have you done this, have you written a book on this particular thing? It's to broaden that concept and have it more appropriate to the type of work that people are being hired for, or indeed getting grants for. It's a big, if I go back to our two friends, Tycho and Johannes, they would be fairly at sea if they saw what was going on today. They'd see that fundamentally there's a great similarity in terms of people publishing, in terms of exchanging information. But I think they would be aghast at the fact that you've got a small number of people who are making a vast amount of money out of this on your backs, because remember, it diminishes the amount of money that goes into research. It diminishes the money in the libraries because they got to subscribe to these things, and it also, remember, impacts on you as individuals. Those of you who act as journal editors, peer reviewers. You're doing it for free. And somebody's making a hell of a lot of money out of it in terms of doing this. Nature magazine says it takes about $30,000 to $40,000 to publish one article. I don't believe that. Yeah, it does, because of course everybody's well paid to do that. I don't believe it can cost like that. Counterexample is a group of Dutch, linguists. There was an Elsevier journal called Lingua. The editor is Johan Rurik from the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. And they were fed up, so they decided a few years ago, we're getting out of this. So the entire editorial board, after planning it for 2 years, resigned overnight, and the next day they set up a new open access online journal called Blossa. And they were charging author processing charges of about €500 as opposed to about 5,000. And what they'd done was they developed a business model to say, well, what would it cost to actually produce a journal at a reasonable profit that we can reinvest in the organisation to improve how we present our research and engage the research community. They're not the first, they are the first that've done it in a big scale, let's say. And they brought over the entire research community because Lingua was a very high impact journal. People moved over to the new one because they felt great, it's cheaper and it's high quality and it's open online. Others have followed. So it can be done. It most certainly can be done. And I think looking back in time at what happened in the 16th, 17th centuries, the ways in which people communicated, did their research, was in an open manner. They had a common language. They wrote letters to one another. Of course, we are in a different system. We have a lot more people involved. We have a lot more scientists, a lot more researchers. They're not easily as singly identifiable as they would have been then. And many things have improved as a way. We don't need individual kings, patrons to pay for that. We have research funding agencies which can do it very well. But really, to make science better, make research better, one needs to open it up more. And I think the next few years is really there's a tidal wave developing on this whole area. And it will be important for all of you to keep really abreast of this because it will impact, for those of you at earlier stages in the career, it will impact on your career. There's no doubt about that. And also for those of you more established, it will impact maybe indirectly in the sense that your students, your postdocs will have more demands in terms of this, in terms of engaging in this area. So thank you for your time.
Questions from people who are here. We'll do about 10-15 minutes of that. Yes, so would anyone like to get started? Yes?
Thank you very much, Conor. One group you didn't mention were the professional societies. I'm a chemist, and I've always tried to publish in either the Royal Society of Chemistry Journal or the American Chemical Society Journal. And as you know, the money from that supports the Society's other activities. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I think that it's a good point you raised, and an excellent one, in fact, because it is important to distinguish between the Elseviers of this world and the academic societies who do this for the benefit of researchers in their discipline. And I think that how that will pan out, I don't know. I do know that, in a sense, the Plan S was a blunt instrument, and they decided that they wanted to have the blunt instrument in the first instance to deal with that. But they have come back now and said, okay, we need to deal with the academic societies. We need to deal with lots of other issues in there that could not be done at the mega scale, because their target are the big publishers. Their targets are not the academic societies. So I think what we're going to see over the next couple of years is negotiations on how these things can be resolved in terms of, say, as you mentioned, say the Royal Society or any of the academic publishers. But I don't have an answer as how you do it.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm coming from social policy area.
Could you step up because the acoustics are terrible.
Okay, so I'm asking a question from the social policy arena, and a lot of our research, I'm working in qualitative research. We're looking at committed to open access for data and to the notion of collect less data, do more with it, and that, because it's very resource intensive, but it's also not just for the researchers, but also for your research participants. So we're looking at what the university's, I suppose, strategy is for developing a repository for this kind of data. At the moment, available to us is the Irish Social Science Data Archive, hosted in Maynooth. And while it's got an incredibly good infrastructure, I have an institutional kind of, I would like to have some relationship through my institution with that entity. And I wondered, is there any consideration by our institutions to have collaboration for these kinds of repositories, that each institution could have, you know, some kind of shared cooperative ownership of this kind of infrastructure for researchers? So that's one question. And the second one, just is in terms of the category of service to discipline. You know, you're saying about doing reviews for journals, it's free labour on the part of academics. Are the institutions thinking about recalibrating the category of service to the discipline, that it will in some way support a movement towards liberal scholarship? You know, is that kind of possible for us to think about that as we think about our career progression?
Well, I don't have a specific answer to those questions, but I agree that there are two major issues. One is on the infrastructure for hosting data. And certainly there is an awful lot of work going on at European level on the European Open Science Cloud. But one of the things which, just a kind of an aside on that, is the things that I'm always concerned about is that having a cloud is great, but it's what's its viability long term. Unfortunately, I still have I have tapes of data research from the VAC 780, which basically is in I think it's in like the O'Reilly Institute museum box, and the terminals are. So, you know, that's immediate. Now, on the other hand, people have, you know, if you go to the library here, you can find books from the 15th century, which have persisted over time. The Geological Survey has core samples going back 200 years, which is data. There is a real issue of the longevity and the persistence of data over time with this, but it is something which institutions need to deal with. The second point you made, I think, again, it's back on the institutions, and I'll just say that the League of European Research Universities, who met in Trinity last week, they were discussing that particular point because they realised that the momentum has come from the funders, but they need to react to this, to change within the system, because if the system doesn't change internally and voluntarily, then things will happen as a reaction to the funders' approach rather than a well-developed construct. But I see somebody down the back there who might actually be able to add to that. Niamh, I think I am talking to you, of course I am.
I mean, there are some things, and it's wonderful to hear that you have this great institutional pride and affiliation. It's a great thing to have. And this is an amazingly important point. There is an infrastructure out there that we can use right now, and we are collaborating in Europe with Zenodo, which is the European Commission's portal. Have put their data into Zenodo. It's free and it's really good and it's to publications, but still we keep have this thing that we like to keep it in our own area, and that's completely understandable. So within the next week, we'll see the national policy that's been adopted by the National Open Research Forum, and I've just received the final version of that today. That's committing Ireland to building an infrastructure that will support this, and there will be within the next year that will get involved. And I hope that everybody here who is interested in this area will get involved in this. First, there will be a call for the funders to come and endorse this policy, the Irish funders. So it looks quite close to Plan S, and there's a whole research data side to this, so that environment is moving to good practice in this area. A lot of it is linked in with what the European Commission is requiring from all of the member states, and they want us to have some very obvious things, like Conor mentioned, a digital preservation strategy. So how are Department of Business Enterprise and Innovation, or provide a secretariat for this group along with the Department of Education and Science. We can push through this demand if we can get that clearly articulated. So hopefully we can work together that and not, too far away. But meanwhile, if anybody wants to know where they can put their data to be compliant with their funding requirements, come and talk to me about it. I talk to people about it every day.
No, you're right. That's a really good point you raised, I think, because, and in particular for early career researchers, when you're gathering your data, I mean, if you look at it here, if you're producing high quality data here, and you're putting it up online straight away, then you've got research teams all over the world say, wow, this is brilliant, let's use it and publish. And the first thing is that at the moment, and this is another critical point, if it is published, even now or later on, there needs to be a way of having you recognised as the creator, as the person that developed that data as well, so that there is that reference. But in the same way that when you go to, say, publications where people say, well, you need to, for example, if there's commercial sensitivity, there's an embargo period on the publication. There has to be an embargo period on data as well, while it can be exploited by the research team itself and have the opportunity to publish. Yeah, I mean, it is important to do that. I agree fully. And
I was just going to ask you a question about the costs again. We do hear those figures that journals are going to cost a huge amount to publish. But so even when you talk about a €500, that is still very expensive for people who come from areas where the research isn't funded. So I'm worried, I suppose, when you look at it, that we're just going to kind of move the point of the tyranny, if you know what I mean, and kind of unfair business model to a different spot, and end up including and excluding different people in that space. So when you look right across, we say, from the arts, humanities and the sciences, I think it's complicated trying to figure out how that's going to work.
Well, you're right. I mean, it is a complex picture, but I think there is a fundamental shift in terms of doing this, because if you look at the moment that you have, if you are funded, say, by a funding agency, you pay for your author processing charge for publishing. Your library is then having to go and subscribe to that journal, and if anybody else wants to look at it, and I think another just a point on this as well, that one of the real big downsides of publishing in the closed journals in that it really gives inequality globally of access to research results. It means people in Africa, in countries in Asia, which simply do not have the money at all, at any level, for any discipline, to be able to access research. They don't have it. But coming back to your point, I think that by doing this, I mean, if you go back to that journal I mentioned, Lingua Tedlossa, that Lingua eliminated, once the author processing charge, that amount was paid, there were no more costs, because everything went online and was freely available after. There were no library costs for it, because it was freely available. So it reduced the cost of the library. But you're right, there needs to be a business model properly put forward to deal with this, so that disciplines which are not the discipline, and let's be clear, it's the humanities and social sciences that don't have access to major research funding, that have a means to be able to participate fully in this whole process. But you're right, and that's why I say that there are so many different things that need to be resolved in what is coming up as being a short space of time.
Yeah, sorry, it's just about one comment that you had. We recently moved from
Yeah.
Do we really need to be paying that sort of money when there's such a variety of facilities available? If you just use ordinary procurement processes, you'll actually find much better deals that actually, really offer.
It does, you're quite right, but it does need, I mean, the tools are there to do it, there's no doubt about that. But somebody actually has to do it. And of course, in the past, the publishers were great because they did everything for you. And I mean, there was a time when the publishers did provide a significant service. When you put your publication together and stuck in your graphs and did all of that by hand, and then you sent it off to them in a big brown envelope, and you got it back in this lovely typeset version in all bound and nice and pretty. Whereas now, none of that's needed, because anyway, what you send to them is already pretty much done with the ability of what you can do on your computer anyway. So it's looking at, I mean, these people in linguistics did precisely that. They looked at how could they go from one model to another, and they were highly successful at it. And mostly so because the fact they maintained the quality, they brought the whole quality of the research community with them, and kept all the key researchers as the people who were peer reviewers with them as well. So it's a big challenge, and I certainly wouldn't underestimate it. But it is something which is going to, which to a large extent has been forced on the system, but the system also has to respond in a way that ensures, and another point I want to come back to as well, you mentioned early career researchers. They are the most vulnerable in this entire process, because they are the ones who are now looking for jobs, and they're in a transition phase. By 2020, if you go into open research now and start publishing open online, and you don't have your high impact factor journals when you apply for a job in the US or somewhere else, will you get it? And the answer is no, you won't. In the current system, you won't. So it does need a significant change. There's no doubt about that. Well, I think I think any researcher should know it's not a sensible thing to do that, because it's fine if you can share in a closed network. If you have a closed network of like-minded colleagues working in the same area, you can share with them. That's good. But if you're planning to publish things like that without peer review, then it's not a sensible idea. It really isn't. They can put regulations in place, but quite frankly, I think that when you're dealing with things like Twitter, social media, regulations, there's always ways around them, and people will simply just go on doing it. It's more to change the culture of how people approach these things. And at the same time, realise that these social media platforms can be very, very powerful as well. They can be very powerful means for communication, especially in a global research community.
Sorry, I just wanted to follow up on that. There's a lot of articles out now at the moment about publish first and curate second, so it's kind of your idea. And I think actually, Dennis, you mentioned to me even in the music scene the whole idea that someone you create whatever you want to create, and then a trusted voice kind of gathers them together and says, I recommend this bunch. And I was just wondering what your comments on that. I think The Guardian had an article in the last week about publish first and curate second. It's similar to what you're saying, but just in maybe more organised
fashion. It's a good point. I don't know the music area at all, I understand that, yeah. Well, I think that I think if you take if you take the area that I would come from in physics, then there have been over time. I mean, one of the things that's often forgotten is that the idea of open science and this whole process is not new. It has actually been there for a long, long time. Particularly going back to our two friends here, the astronomy field and astrophysics field has always remained a very open platform for publication. One, because they share data from telescopes. And they share the data for the simple reason that no one research group would have the capacity to analyse and deal with that data, and do quite a lot of open work together. But that was within a trusted community, and it works very well when you can do that. If you simply just publish at first without having had it in any way reviewed, well, what you run the risk of as a researcher, you run the risk of making major errors in your publications and getting a reputation on the downside of that. So I think I think a level of peer review is needed before you publish. Because now it may not be the case for all disciplines, because what you're publishing is not based on data. It's a different concept, perhaps in music. But in let's say in the experimental sciences, I wouldn't think that'd be a good approach at all.
Just follow up picking a couple of comments. You were saying earlier that researchers as reviewers and editors, they give their paper for free, which is true, but we do get back as academics a benefit. We wouldn't submit to journals unless it was a benefit. So it isn't necessarily all taken and no receive. We do get a benefit in terms of publishing, and I think that should be acknowledged. But I seem to hear from several points you made that publishers are no longer add value. You talked about taking raw manuscripts in the past and formatting them all the like. But do you not think that publishers do give us a benefit in terms of when I started researching, I had to put in a request. If the library didn't have it and went into library loan, it would take a couple of weeks for something to come from the British Library. Today I can just go down to my desk, it's immediately there in a few clicks, and a huge range of journals. And you give the example of the Lingua one from the Netherlands, top-rate journal, I'm sure they can, I suppose, get the money and do it, but there are lots of niche journals. If all these narrower, or lots of journals will go do that, as a sort of multidisciplinary researcher, how are you going to, for instance, get the benefits of whether it's Web of Science or Scopus, where you're trying to pull, I suppose, access the knowledge just out there in a sort of a convenient manner. And what I'm referring to in that sense, the publishers have the servers and the longevity that you can access this resource. If you have a Lingua journal replicated like Mushroom House, are all these going to be pulled together in the same way? And who is going to oversee that? Do the publishers not provide some value, which I think in several places you seem to indicate that we don't need them anymore. We need somebody instead of them, I would suggest.
Well, I think the fundamental point is that yes, they add value, but the cost of that added value is way, way above what it's worth. And that they have, and as you rightly say, yes, if you're the member of, if you're a peer reviewer for a journal, if you're on an editorial board, yes, you gain some value from it, but they're gaining a tremendous amount of value from your time, from your effort and input into this, which I don't believe is actually repaid to the research community. And you're essentially doing their work for them, or a large part of the work. Yes, they do provide now, because they have moved into an online environment, they do provide access to a large amount of information. They do have access through the system of Web of Science, etc. But I think this is what the funders are pushing at now, trying to change that system. I don't believe it's going to change very easily, but the current model where a vast amount of money is going out of the research sector into publishers is completely disproportionate, I think, to what the value that they give back to the research community in that. And it is becoming more and more closed in that way. And it's not just the research community within any one system in Europe, but it's the global research community as well. Because certainly within all of the scientific disciplines, and indeed other disciplines, the ability to communicate, to work with researchers around the world is critical. Now, I've done work in Eastern Europe, in Bulgaria and in Montenegro, and you look at their resources there. They don't have the money to subscribe to many of these journals. They simply don't have it, and the publishers won't do deals with them on these things. They won't give them a good deal. They really have closed their system very, very effectively, and that's what needs to change. The good parts of the whole process need to remain, and it's not clear at the moment how they will remain. And there are lots of issues, as your colleague pointed out, about academic societies, for example, or the issue that you brought up about niche journals. And but perhaps with niche journals, that is where it is the researchers within that discipline can actually take control of the system themselves. And I think the point as well that the people in Lingua, it's based in the Netherlands because he was the editor, but it's actually a global journal, so the people came from around the world, and it's hosted through Utrecht University at the moment. And I imagine that's what the way other journals will operate on that kind of a model. But it does, what they have shown is that you can do something and you can go from this very high cost basis to a reasonable cost basis for your research community, but yet retain all the value of the editors, of the peer reviewers, and of the community in that sense.
One just quick follow-up. When you said just there about the academics taking it back and running it themselves, in a sense, I like the idea that I can give it to the publisher and then deal with that, but nothing new to do without having to start something else.
Well, I should explain a bit better then. That's what they've done with the Lingua to Glossa Journal, because they have used the money they take in from their author processing charges to have an administration that can run that. And I think, if you look at the academic societies, this is the way they originally operated. It was letters in, then they were collected into, you go back to the Royal Irish Academy here, the letters and the various like the Royal Society in the UK. They had an administration that did all of that. And that can certainly be replicated. That's not a difficult model to replicate, but it is, and it can be done for niche journals as well. It is more difficult in a sense because the bigger the community, the more money there is to support a business model. Maybe with niche journals there needs to be different journals groups working together, let's say, across similar disciplines to achieve that. But it does require effort. There's no doubt about it. And it is. I certainly believe that change is important. That it opens up the system more. It gives greater value to what you're putting into the system as researchers, as peer reviewers, and it also then makes all of that research accessible to the global research community, and also to people. Remember, people who are outside academia who are engaged in research don't have access to it either, unless they're willing to pay. Well, I think that's a good point you raise, because what you can, currently for some areas there's no difficulty in doing that in archive, and that certainly in astronomy, and that you can publish brief letters and that on what you're doing, because these are the areas I know, let's say. So you can do that. Then you can publish the full articles afterwards, and so that is not. Now there are some disciplines, in fact, which won't let you do this. The American Chemical Society is totally militant in this way, in that if you publish anything in any kind of an online forum, bang, you can never publish it in their journal then, because they say it has been published. So I think one of the things which, in terms of moving in this sort of model, is that you can change that, because you can say, no, that's fine, because your policy briefings are short documents which you want to influence policy. You don't want to wait for another year before you write your paper on it. You actually want to do that. But I don't see I don't see that has to be a contradiction in this case, because it is something which actually already exists in some disciplines.